Louis Vuitton is the most valuable luxury fashion brand in the world. Its CEO Bernard Arnault is also the wealthiest man on the planet with a net worth of around $180 billion and leaving behind Elon Musk. Looking at success of today, you would never guess that the company was started by a man who was homeless during his teenage years. Louis Vuitton is a true rag to riches story. This is the insane story of Louis Vuitton and how a tiny family business evolved into one of the most powerful brands in the world. Louis Vuitton was born in 1821 and grew up working on his family farm in France in a small village called Anchet. In the middle of nowhere, they had no electricity and no running water. Louis's father Xavier was a miller and farmer, whilst his mother Corinne made hats to help make some extra cash. There are no records showing that Louis ever received an education. The nearest school was in a village 6 miles away, and it's believed he worked full-time on the family farm without learning how to read. Louis was born into a situation that should have doomed him from ever having a bright future, and then things got much worse. Louis's mother died when he was just 10 years old, and his father quickly remarried another woman. But Louis's new stepmother was incredibly controlling and manipulative towards him, and he constantly got into fights with her. And so when he was just 13 years old, he ran away from home with plans to go to Paris. He slipped out in the middle of the night without even saying goodbye. There was just one problem. Paris was 225 miles away and Louis had no money or food, so he was forced to walk along dirt roads most nights. He slept in the woods with an empty stomach and just a cloak to keep him warm. But at this rate, travel was incredibly slow. It took him 3 years to reach Paris. Not long after he arrived in Paris, Louis was able to work as an apprentice box maker and packer. Box makers would make custom-sized boxes for clients as well as pack and unpack them whenever a client was about to go on a trip. This job allowed him to meet many people from the upper class who were looking for custom-made luggage for their travels. And Louis worked there for several years learning the craft and working as hard as he could. In fact, in 1851, the Empress of France ended up being a customer and took notice of his fine craftsmanship. She appointed him as her personal box maker and packer. For most box makers, this would be the highest honor anyone could ever achieve in their career. Louis had gone from a homeless teenager with nothing to his name to now working a prestigious job amongst royalty. That was a massive achievement on its own. But Louis Vuitton had an even bigger vision for his future after getting married when he was 33. Louis used his savings to start his own business and opened up his own box-making workshop in Paris to begin selling his own products. You see, Louis had noticed a major flaw in the luggage of the day. All of the boxes were made of leather and had rounded dome-shaped tops so that rain would roll off the top of the luggage. The major issue was that it was impossible to stack them, so packers had to carry the boxes one by one. Louis began experimenting with different materials to use instead, and found that canvas was lighter, durable, and more water-resistant, which meant the trunks could have flat tops. Instead, this made everything more efficient as it was now possible to stack them up in a pile and pack multiple trunks at the same time. And they were also more. Louis's new suitcase design brought on the dawn of modern-day luggage. At this point, Louis had already built up his professional reputation as well as connections to the upper class. So once he launched his new line of luggage, it was immediately a huge success. He even created a Louis Vuitton catalog so the customers could look up products that he had available and have them made before sending it to their homes. Within 2 years of creating his new suitcases, they were considered an elegant and must-have accessory amongst the wealthy. Around that time, more and more people were beginning to travel by train and boats, so the number of his potential customers increased exponential. Traveling was no longer a hobby. Exclusive to the rich, people from all walks of life were now in need of high-quality luggage. It would seem as though Louis had made it and would go on to succeed for the rest of his life. Unfortunately, that was not the case. France was heading to war, and tragedy was about to strike once again for Louis Vuitton. In 1870, when Louis was 49 years old, the Franco-Prussian War broke out. Louis had to flee his home and live in a cramped shelter with thousands of others. Food supplies were extremely low, and he feared for his life. When Louis could finally return to his shop in 1871, everything was destroyed. Windows were smashed, equipment was stolen, and he had lost everything he'd worked so hard for. But instead of giving, he decided to use his savings to rebuild the business and vowed that it would be even better than it was before. With so many people displaced from the war, there were far more empty shops available for rent throughout the city. So Louis Vuitton took advantage of this by opening his new shop in a much more wealthy, aristocratic location. Many other brands tried to copy his style, but his bags were such ridiculously high quality. But customers still preferred a true Louis Vuitton bag for the next 20 years. Louis continued to work at his new shop in Paris until his death when he was 70 years old. But his legacy was able to live on through his son George, who took over the family business. George sought out to expand the brand globally, such as opening a popular store in London. At this point, Louis Vuitton luggage was so popular that many other box makers were beginning to make counterfeits. So in 1896, George Vuitton brought out the now iconic LV monogram to make it harder to copy. The LV were his father's initials in honor of the man who started the brand. But he also came up with the idea of adding a revolutionary new lock on the trunk that would make it impossible for thieves to pick them. The company also began to expand into a whole new line of products because of another fashion icon, Coco Chanel. In 1925, she commissioned a small dome-shaped handbag. At first, this was a design that she personally came up with, and it was just for her. However, it would go on to be mass-produced, and it was given the name Alma. This was massively successful. So Louis Vuitton decided to make more small leather bags like the Kipper, Speedy, and No. Before Louis Vuitton handbags were often seen as quite inelegant and bulky, but the company played a big role in them being seen as much more fashionable. George Vuitton died in 1936, and the company was then passed over to his son, Gaston. Louis, however, Gaston took over the company at a very difficult time because in just a few years, France was once again heading to. During World War II, contracts were cancelled, and Gaston was forced to shut down the Louis Vuitton factory. Paris was under siege again. The only way Gaston Vuitton could save the business was to collaborate with Nazi Germany. An author named Stephanie Bon Vinci wrote a book called Louis Vuitton: A French Saga. During her research of the company archives, she asked if she could see records from World War II. Almost immediately, the representatives from the company tried to avoid showing her the information. They claimed that all of the documents from 1930 to 1945 were destroyed in a fire, but after doing a lot of digging into other historic documents, Stephanie discovered that Louis Vuitton was able to open a glamorous ground floor shopfront in the hotel to park throughout the Nazi regime as they collaborated with them. Meanwhile, several other brands were forced to shut down because they refused to cooperate with the Nazis. Clearly, the company was ashamed of this part of their, but they would argue Gaston did what he needed to do in order for the company to survive. When Gaston passed away in 1970, his son-in-law, Henry Reur, took over managing the Louis Vuitton brand. So we're now onto the fourth generation. But unlike his ancestors, Henry already had a lot of business experience from a company he'd run before. So when he took over Louis Vuitton, he was able to elevate the brand to a whole new level. Henry began making major changes to the Louis Vuitton brand in order to grow it from a family-owned company to the massive corporation that it is today. He switched Louis Vuitton's business model from wholesale to retail by 1970. He'd expanded Louis Vuitton into many other countries, including Japan. And over the course of 6 years, and accounting for modern inflation, sales went from 20 million to 260 million. And so in 1984, Henry decided to take the company public, and Louis Vuitton sold out the 1 million shares valued at $63.63 each. Henry took this momentum and influx of cash and began opening more stores all across the globe. By 1987, Louis Vuitton reached $1 billion in sales. It was far beyond what young Louis could have ever dreamed of when he first opened his first store in Paris. Henry also decided that the company should combine with Moët Hennessy, a luxury drinks company, which produced champagne and cognac, and together they formed their new luxury con, called LVMH in theory. By joining together, it would allow them to pool resources and expand even faster. Unfortunately, after the merger, Henry didn't end up getting along well with the president of Moët Hennessy. So Henry asked a successful property developer he knew named Bernard Arnault to help him manage the situation. Unfortunately, inviting him in as an investor would backfire in a huge way. Bernard secretly bought 43% of the shares of Louis Vuitton and got support from the Moët and Hennessy families to gain more power in LVMH. Henry felt he'd been betrayed by the man he'd brought in to help him, and so took Bernard to court demanding that he should no longer have the majority stake in Louis Vuitton. But the courts ultimately sided with Bernard. Henry was so angry about being backstabbed by his friend that he decided to quit working for Louis Vuitton completely. Now, for the first time in nearly 100 years, no one from the Vuitton family was involved with them. After all of this drama of Bernard's host takeover, sales of Louis Vuitton began to crash. Journalists were no longer covering the brand, and for a while it looked as though the company might fail. However, Bernard knew how to turn the fortune of the company around. Louis Vuitton was able to make a comeback when it began to collaborate with several fashion designers during its 100th anniversary collection. Big names like Vivienne Westwood and Isaac Meiser all created their own take on the iconic LV monogram logo. They created products that customers had never seen before, and people were once again trying to get their hands on a Louis Vuitton bag. Ultimately, Bernard's investment in Louis Vuitton paid off in a massive way. He is now the CEO of LVMH. And in 2021, Forbes officially dubbed him the richest man in the world with a net worth of over $180 billion. Now, of course, as stock prices move, these richest rankings change, but he's almost always in the top 5 richest people in the world. However, the wealthiest people like Bezos, Musk, Gates, Buffett, Bernardo is definitely the least known as he prefers to stay out of the spotlight. What we do know is he has such a ruthless reputation in business. He is known as the Wolf in Cashmere, which is why today LVMH has over 70 different brands. Through all of the acquisitions of mergers Bernard has pulled off, this one company owns so many of the most luxurious brands in the world. And yet it all started with a broke, homeless teenager. But what do you think of Louis Vuitton? Do you think it's overpriced by all the hype? Or do you feel that the quality of the products justifies the massive price tag? Comment below and then make sure you watch the next video in the series of luxury brands, which is the story of the orphan who built Rolex and answers the question, why is Rolex really so expensive? The Rolex video is the perfect video to watch after this one, so we'll hopefully see you there. I think you'll really like this one. But anyways, thanks for watching this video to the end.